So we're starting to get into more advanced algebra concepts. We just learned about our key features. We learned about function notation. And now we're going to expand on function notation and talk about domain and range. So domain and range are the input and are another way we call the input and output values. But it doesn't specifically mean x and y. It means the acceptable x values. So domain of a function is all of the x values. And it's the x values that make sense for a situation. It's not, in a situation or graph. And it's the same thing for this. So it's all the x or y values. The y values are called the range of a function. Okay? So when we talk about domain and range, what we're talking about is we're talking about our list of acceptable x and y values. So this means not x and y is every x and y. It means which x and y values work for this situation. Okay? One of the things that we need to recall that you learned before in order for us to be able to answer these questions is we need to recall when you graph inequalities, which I know you did last year, but we're going to review it again. If you recall, a circle like this is less than or greater than. When I'm looking at a graph, a dot is less than or equal to, greater than or equal to. And the way I think of it is I think of it as like a force field. So you see how right here there's a bubble here? It's like there's a force field, because I like sci-fi. There's a force field around that value, and I can get close to it, but I can't get inside. So I can get right up to the edge of it, but I can't exactly hit x is -4 or y is -1. So I can't include those values in my list of appropriate values for the situation. So we're actually going to do this a little bit out of order. So again, domain is our x values, y is our range. Okay, so we're going to do these a little bit out of order. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to distinguish between having dots and between having a line like this. When you see dots, you're going to write your domain and range a little bit differently. So let's take a look. Let's zoom in a little closer on this example. All right. Again, when you have dots, it's going to be a little different. Let me mess with the focus here. See if oh, wow, that's so much better. Okay. So when I have dots, what I'm going to do is for my domain, and I like to use two different colors. When I use dots, I'm going to look at my domain, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to smoosh. This is the official strategy. It's smoosh. Smoosh. Okay, I'm going to smoosh those values onto the x-axis. So I see a dot here. I'm going to transfer it up onto the x-axis. I see one here. I'm going to transfer it down. So I'm going to put all of these values onto the x-axis so I can see what they're worth. Okay? And then since these are dots, my domain is going to be a list. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow about what those dots mean. We'll talk about tomorrow when we do discrete and continuous, we'll talk about why we have dots and why we have lines. We'll explain what that means in the real world later, but for now, let's talk about how we're going to write these domains and ranges. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list these 5 values. So I have an x, see, remember domain is my x. So I have x values of -4, -1, 1, 2, and 5. So those are my domain values, my x values that pertain to this situation. Okay. Now, when I want to look at my range values, I'm also going to smoosh, but instead of smooshing to the x, because domain is x, I'm going to smoosh to y, because range is y. So see, I'm going to smoosh this onto the y-axis, and it makes it easier for me to read them. Smoosh that one, smoosh that one, smoosh that one, and smoosh that one. Okay. Now, you can do this a couple of ways. You can list them exactly how you see them, or you can try to line them up. It really doesn't matter. I like to go from least to greatest. So I have -4, -3, 1, 3, 5. And that's my range. And I put them in fancy brackets. I call them fancy brackets because it makes me happy, but technically they're called braces. I think that's the official grammar word for them, but I like to call them fancy brackets because fancy brackets, and then I waggle my fingers like jazz fingers. Fancy brackets, and then I say fancy real high because it makes me happy. Okay, so if I see dots, okay, so if I see dots on a graph, that means I have a list of values. Okay, so when I see dots like this, I have a list of values. And this is just, all we're doing is we're writing our list of x and y values that work for this graph. Okay, now, when we have graphs like this with connected lines, we're going to treat them a little differently. And I call this strategy the blockout strategy. And it works, I think it works pretty well. Okay, so what you're going to do is, anywhere that you don't have values, you're going to block them out with your highlighter. So you see how right here, my line doesn't go any further than this? Actually, let's look at this one first. I think this is easier to do. Okay, so you see how the lowest y value I have is right there? So I'm going to black out everything else on the graph. And then up here is my highest y value. So I'm going to, well, highlight out whatever on the graph. Now over here I don't have anything that goes bigger than -2. So I'm going to black that out. And I'm going to black out everything else on this graph. Okay. Now, even though my graph doesn't go on past 5, I can also see that I don't have any values that are lower than -5. Sorry. So I'm going to black that out too. Now, what you see now is that all of my x values are between -5 and -2. -5 and -2. Now, the way we write that mathematically, we put a -5 and a -2. We put an x in between them and put less than or equal to signs. Well, okay. Let's put it over here because there's not enough room. So first of all, remember when I said over here, a bubble means I can't include the value? So I have a bubble here. So I have my smallest value is -5, my biggest value is -2, my x is between them. Since I can't, I'm always going to put less than signs. Can I include this value? No, because it's inside the force field, so I don't put the line underneath it. Can I include this value? No, it's inside the force field, so I leave it like that. So this is my domain. And again, we'll talk about this more in class tomorrow. Part of this is we might have a gap in your, what's it called, your inequality stuff. Okay. Now, if I look here, if I look at my range is where I'm squishing on when I'm looking at what the y values are. The y values are up and down. The smallest y value I have is -4. The biggest y value I have is +4. My y values are going to be in between them. I start by putting less than signs, and then I evaluate these endpoints. If they're bubbles, I can't include them because my force field, they have a force field around them. If they're dots, like for example, if it was a dot like here, a dot, I could include it. Okay? Since they're both bubbles, I leave it like that. Okay? I know this is a little crazy. Let's try this one here. This is the next easiest one. So again, I'm going to bust out my highlighter, and I'm going to highlight. I'm going to highlight all the space that my graph is not in. It's like I'm excluding it. Everything I highlight is excluded. It's not included. Now, notice when I bubble here, I'm bubbling the highest value. So none of my graphs should be covered up. Okay? And hang on, once I'm done, I'll show you what it looks like when it's all bubbled up. Now, if you look at this, notice I did not go from beginning to end. I went from the highest y to the lowest y, from the lowest x to the highest x. I went between the values. So I didn't go from 1 to 2. I went all the way down from -3 all the way up to +3. Okay? So again, let's think about this. My x values. What is the lowest x value I have? Well, the lowest value I see over here is -5. All of my values are locked into this little box, so they're between these values. So my biggest value is +4. My x is in the middle. I always put less than signs in between them. So this is between -5 and 4. Now I'm going to look at the endpoints. If you see a dot, we put or equal to and include it. If you see a dot over here, we put or equal to and include it. All right? Let's look at our y. Okay? My y goes from here to there. And again, if you wanted to do this with the blue pen over here, you could do the same thing. Okay? So my y goes, my smallest y is -3. My biggest y is +3. And all my other y values are going to be in the middle. Now, I don't see a dot here, but I do see my graph touching it. If you don't see a bubble like that, you're going to include those values. So we put the or equal to. All right? Let's look at this one next. Okay, let's look at this one next. Okay, now, when I look at this one, I see an arrow, okay? An arrow means that it goes on forever. An arrow means forever and ever. So even though I don't see anything graphed past here, I can't highlight it because I know that those values continue, and that if my graph were bigger, I would see values there. So but I know down here, it doesn't go past this point. So I know I can highlight down here, and I can highlight over here, okay? But I'm not, the only place, so my lowest x value is here, but over here, I have an arrow continuing on forever. You see, because if I continued this line up, you see how it would continue and it would be an arrow? Since it's an arrow, that means it doesn't stop. So what this means is I don't have anything in between. So you see how these were locked in between? This isn't locked in between. So what this means is that all of my x values are bigger than positive 4. Now, can I include positive 4? No, because it's inside a force field, so I'm just going to leave it greater than. I'm not going to do greater than or equal to. All right, let's look at the y values. Y values are the same. My lowest y value is right there at -1. And it keeps on going forever. So if I were to draw a line, I would go like that, because you see how there's an arrowhead right here? It keeps on going. So my y values are greater than -1. Since this is a bubble, I can't put or equal to because I can't include that value. Okay, and this is actually, believe it or not, this is the hardest one. Okay, so let's look at the domain on this one. Okay, if I look, you see how there's a, you know what, we're not going to do this one. I don't like this one for a variety of reasons. I don't like this one. So I want you to kind of think about that. I know that was a little tricky, but I want you to think about that. Make sure that you write down any questions you have, and I will we'll go over this some more tomorrow.